could find such a love at our age. Whoever thought we could dance on?
Welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm your co-host, Judy Alexander, and I'm here with my husband, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
Hello, Judy. Hello, viewers and listeners. Judy, what's today's podcast?
Digital Overwhelm, an interview with Craig Mattson.
We just had that interview. He is just delightful.
He is.
Yeah. And, who'd have thunk that we would want to have somebody on whose main shtick is all about organizational work. Mm-hmm. But he pointed out, when we first got in contact, there is a lot of overlap with that in couples work. And that's, indeed, there certainly was. And I think we found that in our conversation. Yes. So you're in for a treat. Tune in, stay tuned. First, of course, we will do our little touting of our great stuff that we have. What are you going to start with?
Certainly. Why don't we start with Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again.
That's my most recent book. Mm-hmm. You can find that anywhere books are sold. You know what? Little hint, folks. If you go to Amazon and search for Betrayal Trauma, it's going to come up near the top, and you can get it that way. And if you do it that way, apparently that tweaks Amazon's algorithms to give it even more often. So that's a nice way to get it.
Okay.
Just a thought. Even if you don't buy it, if you go there and just search for it and click on it or something. Of course, then my advertising thing will have to pay for that click. So if you're not going to buy it, don't do that. But anyway, get a hold of that book. It's a good book.
It's a good book.
Keep hearing from folks. I've had actually a number of people now who have come into my practice because they read the book.
Yes.
And they found the book really helped them, if nothing else, calm down to the point where then they could talk about doing therapy in the midst of a serious betrayal of some kind. And what else do we have?
Okay, then there was your previous book. It's Not About Communication, Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong.
That came up briefly in our conversation.
Yes, it did.
Actually, so did Betrayal and Forgiveness came up briefly in our conversation.
Well, we were talking all about communication.
Yes,
it did come up.
Absolutely. And the book, as you point out.
The book that started the podcast, Reigniting the Spark, Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back.
Absolutely. And that's a book that's really centered on the 7 words of our podcast. Tell people the 7 words of our podcast.
Be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
And we haven't been making a point of saying this, but that for folks who are actually viewing this, for the very small number of you who are viewing it, because the vast numbers of you who are listening to this are probably just listening, Judy is holding up a beautiful mug.
The 11-ounce size mug.
The 11-ounce size. We also have a 15-ounce size mug that is our Couples Therapy in 7 Words merch. We also have a fabulous tote bag that you can get that we use our tote bags all the time.
All the time.
On one side, it has the beautiful logo that Judy designed with a heart and the number 7 in it and Couples Therapy in 7 Words. And on the other side, it has the 7 words. Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Words to live by, words to drink your coffee from.
And words that came up in our conversation.
And they came up, of course, as
Funny
they
how that
so
happens.
often do, came up in our conversation. And Judy, there's another book that we should talk about.
Yes, and we were actually talking about biblical texts today.
Though we didn't talk about this particular spin on biblical texts.
But this happens to be my book, The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible by my nom de plume, Laria Zilber.
Lariazyl. BER. That spelling is how you can get to lariazilber.com, where you can get information about it. You get to see an interview with Laria herself, who strikingly resembles my beautiful wife here, except she has blue hair. On her, it looks good. What can I say? You, not so much, but on her, it looks good.
Right, and the biblical text came up, but because we were talking about situations that are overwhelming. So this, The Blue Tent, Erotic Tales from the Bible, definitely not overwhelming.
Well, overwhelming in all the right ways. It's certainly whelming. It's interesting, as you'll see in our conversation with Craig Mattson, he talks about digitwhelm, and the reason he says digitwhelm rather than digital overwhelm only is sometimes it's overwhelming, sometimes it's underwhelming, but it's often whelming. I love that concept.
Can something be whelming?
Yes, indeed.
I guess it can.
It can. Let's get on with the interview. We'll see you on the other side.
Our guest today is Craig Mattson. Craig is an organizational researcher and author and professor at Calvin University. He has done original research on the disconnection and intensity many American workers feel in their organizational communities. His expertise draws on original research and spiritual wisdom to build a practical framework called mode switching for transforming the stresses of modern work. Craig's recent book is Digital Overwhelm, a mid-career guide to coping at work. Craig, welcome to Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
This is my first time to be on a couples therapy podcast, so I'm really keen to learn from you and to make connections between our projects.
Well, just disclosure, Bruce is actually the couples therapist. I'm not.
Well, you are more than not. Judy's a retired educator.
Okay.
And we do like to say, yeah, I'm the therapist and she's the real person. But it helps to have that balance sometimes. She's also very good with a hook as necessary. When I get going, I can nerd out pretty easily. So
Sure.
there we are. Well, we always like to start out by asking our guests, how did you get into the work you do? Tell us something about your own journey.
I definitely stumbled into it during COVID, feeling lonely and a little bit disoriented, like so many people. I did that like such a white middle-aged guy thing to do. I started a podcast and I just started
Can't imagine that. Gee. Yeah.
I hope that's not too much on the nose, Dr. Bruce.
A
Yes.
little bit.
So yeah, I started reaching out to alumni of the place I used to teach, small faith-based liberal arts college in Chicago, and I felt stunned by the stories I was hearing about workplace culture from the perspective of Gen Z and millennial working professionals. And I thought, there's a book here. There's a study to be done here. And so I sort of opened a formal qualitative research project, and I talked to dozens of rising professionals, and I learned a lot from their stories and their insights.
Hmm. And you're just, if you can explain to people, I mean, you're a professor at Calvin University, and what is your field? It's communications, right? Is that right?
It is. It is. That probably tells people very little, right? Oh, you study how to talk?
That was your
Well,
major.
actually, that was
Yeah.
my major,
Oh.
rhetoric and communications. Well,
Oh.
theater, rhetoric and communications. Yes, so I'm quite familiar with the field.
Oh, great. Great to be among kin. Yes, communication is a big, messy field that encompasses everything from very sort of computer sciencey sort of stuff all the way over to, actually something like therapy. So I'm kind of in the middle. I started studying something called speech communication, which is akin to theater. And yes, and then at the doctoral level, I went on to study rhetoric. But lately, my address has been, yeah, organizational life, like what's going on there. And so I was hoping to talk with you folks about the intersection of organizational communication and marital communication.
That's pretty much our next question, please.
Well,
Oh,
go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, what is going on there in organizational communication? And then maybe we'll get down into the marriage bit.
Okay, so do you mean, say just a little bit more. Do you mean in?
Well, you said that you're studying organizational communication
Mhm,
and working with the Gen Z folks. So
mhm.
what did you see that you felt was worthy of study?
Yeah. Okay, I see. All right, so I think my kind of going question, which I varied sometimes by the interview, depending on who I was talking to, was put very simply, how are you coping? How are you dealing? And because I had this sort of communication disciplinary lens, because that's my field, I sort of organized it in familiar buckets to me. And so I noticed 6 what I called modes of communication that people use to cope when things get to be a heck of a lot at work. And I put all of these modes on one table, so to speak, all these buckets on one table, and said, what we're dealing with here is digital overwhelm. So I don't think anybody said that to me, like, you know what my problem is? But that was definitely a theme that gathered together the problems and the challenges and the stuckness, also the possibilities and opportunities that I was hearing as I talked to these rising professionals.
Mhm.
So, go ahead.
Well, how so?
Well, what I let me say too, like, why did you talk to rising professionals? Why not talk to Gen Xers or boomers like yourself,
Mm,
more
yeah.
closer to my age? Well, some of it's access. Like these are people I knew, but some of it too was these are people on the more precarious edges of their organizations. They're economically a bit more nimble, to put it kindly, but fragile, to put it a little bit more bluntly. And if you're in that kind of place, you really pay close attention to what's going on in your organization. You have to. And so, yeah, that's why I said I learned a lot from talking with these folks. So, what are they doing? Like, how are they coping? Is that a fair restatement of your question?
Hmm.
Okay. Yes. So I noticed six ways that they were dealing. I'll name just three of them because it can be a lot to remember. But and also I want people to read the book. So like why, why do the
No
what?
spoilers, right?
So I noticed that some people dealt with things by sending things, right? Sometimes we call this delegation, but also it's just that whole realm of like stuff that gets disseminated in an organization. And many of the people I talk to, I'm among them, sort of deal with digital overwhelm by let's write a big fat email, get everybody on the same page, right?
Mhm.
That works for some people. Other people are much more like, we need to talk. We need a
Yeah.
face-to-face conversation, even if it's, across screens. We need to talk one-on-one. So the one-on-one is a beloved organizational communication strategy used by a lot of managers, sometimes to the point of burnout. And it's also, there's a reason it's so widely used. It's often effective. Another mode that I saw was just signaling, maybe approaching digital overwhelm by just doing less. So they might say less, they might email less, they might message less, they might just pull way back on what they're willing to explicitly and directly say. So those are three ways that people deal with digital overwhelm in organizations.
Mm.
Any
It's
of those?
interesting you call that signaling because it's sort of implicit, right? It's like,
Yeah,
well, by doing less, you're
yeah.
not saying explicitly, I'm doing less. You're just doing less. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
You're familiar with quiet quitting, right?
Well, I know that, yes, especially that was around during COVID. That was a big
Right.
term that I read about.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that would be a form of signaling, right? It's
I
like,
think so. I
yeah,
think that
nobody would announce I'm only going to do what's required and maybe
that's
even
right.
less. But that's what they would do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't put that as your status on Slack, like quiet quitting today. That's just not something you're gonna do. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That, I was as I was thinking, I was thinking about how does this apply in the couples realm?
Mm,
Because, and it's interesting as you were describing those modes, because I often notice, actually, I don't think I would have noticed it until I was reading your book, actually, and what you're talking about now. Couples will often do that too. There are couples who will come to therapy. You would think therapy is all about the one-on-one communication. That's
mm,
it's all about that.
mm.
And yet there are folks who will come and it's actually more about dissemination. It's more about saying,
Oh.
this is the truth, and I want you to convince my partner that that's the case. It tends not to work super well in a couple setting. Though it's interesting because when I'm working with couples, the
Mm.
first session, and I wrote about this, by the way, in a book that I can't resist telling you the title of. It's called It's Not About Communication. I love
Oh.
that. It's a very snarky title. We can talk about that. Maybe. But and the subtitle, by the way, is Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy is Wrong.
Oh,
And
yes.
and
I'm
spoiler
here
alert for
for
me,
it.
I do point out that that applies to me too. Everything I know about couples therapy is wrong also, but that's another story. But I talk in that book, I talk about how I structure a first session. And there
Mm,
is a chunk of that first session that's
mm,
all about me disseminating stuff.
mm,
I have a spiel I give to almost every couple about, we have needs for stability and needs for intimacy, and both are important, and the skills you need for those two things are separate.
mm,
In other words, it's the dissemination mode, and
mm,
often it's
mhm,
that part is not particularly a communication. It's a little mini lecture,
mm,
and what happens from that often is I'll get these looks like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. And then we get into really interesting communication.
Mm,
Then it becomes one-on-one and it changes me, it changes them. It's the exchange part as
mm,
opposed to the dissemination part. And
mm.
the signaling also, you see that with couples all the time.
Okay.
The quiet quitting is I'd never thought until this moment of applying that to what couples will often do, but they will often quiet quit in a relationship.
Huh.
They'll often basically say, I'm kind of done with this. And I'm not
Huh.
saying that, but
Or clam up because they don't want whatever they say is going to bother their partner.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Huh. Yes, that's a really interesting connection. Do you ever vary your opening spiel and say, I'm going to give this spiel later and have a dialogue first? Or have you found that it really works best if we just sort of lay down some basic principles and ground rules?
I always address the meta level to nerd out here. I always address the meta level whenever anything, even my very first question, I identify as my favorite question. I say, well, here's my favorite opening question, let's see where it goes, because I want to immediately situate it in saying, I'm not claiming this is the only way to do it. So I don't just give the lecture. I always, in fact, the way I usually introduce it is by saying, hey, any of you happen to see any of this stuff on my website? Not, it's fine if you didn't, but if you did, you might have read about some of this before. And if you're interested in this, you can check it. It's a way I like to structure a first session. In other words, I address that because there had been those occasions when I address that, someone will say, well, really, I want to talk about this first.
Mm-hmm.
That is very unusual, frankly. But
Mm-hmm.
if they do, of course, I'm going to go there.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't insist upon it. I don't say this is the only right way to do it,
Yeah.
but I lay it out, and usually people are intrigued enough that they don't interrupt at that point. I mean, they don't say no, don't do that. If
Uh-huh.
they did, I would be, I'd welcome it. So
Uh-huh.
that it's kind of in between. I don't just insist that this is
Yeah.
a structure and nobody gets to deviate from it, but I
Yes.
do have a structure that I identify as such.
Yes.
Is
Okay.
that yeah?
That's helpful. That's helpful. I was thinking that one of the things I wish I had said in my book, I think it would have helped to make the selling proposition clearer, is something that you just said, and that is that a lot of people, when they face conditions of digital overwhelm, they go minimalist. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. It feels to me like a lot of the self-help books out there are about how to pare down your digital lives. But I don't know. I think my book is recommending something a little different from that. I don't deny that there's sometimes a need for that, depending on the context or the relationship. But I do think that digital flexibility, like you were just exhibiting, is perhaps it's equally important as you're
Mhm.
dealing with overwhelming conditions. So your willingness to say, here's my favorite way to go,
Mhm.
but if you're needing something else or if the relationship requires something else, I can go that way too.
Yeah,
That's,
yeah.
that's basically, I think, my big advice in this book. I never thought to put it that way while I was writing,
Yeah,
but I think that's what I was trying to say.
that is, I think that's what I enjoyed about your book actually was that subtext of, I've been saying this for years. You may remember my saying this like, 20 years ago. I don't know. But that what I look for when I look at any sort of self-help book or any sort of book, any sort of nonfiction book, I look for what I used to refer to as the twinkle in the eye of the author. And the twinkle in the eye I'm referring to is when the author says or implies, they don't have to say it, when they imply, hey, I've got some good ideas here. I know I'm not writing the last word on the subject. I know there are other ways of looking at this.
Hmm.
And, so when I look at a self-help book that's saying, give up on your social media or, pare down your emails or whatever it is that they say, if they say if they say the opposite of what you just said, they say,
Hmm.
this is what you have to do, they kind of lose me. If what
Hmm.
they say is, here's a thought, I know it's not going to work in all circumstances, but throw
It
it in the
might.
mix. Maybe it'll help,
It might. Maybe consider this, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's pretty much how I work with couples also. I, you
Love
know,
it.
I don't want to be, I claim no expertise in living their lives.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
I claim expertise in having certain kinds of conversations that seem
Right,
to help people.
right,
But
right.
they know better than I do how to live their lives. They better.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I wonder, Judy, as you have been, I don't know, have you been involved in these therapeutic conversations, or what's your role in this work?
My role is just the co-host of this podcast.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So what do you think about that? I don't know. What are your tendencies as you think about this? It's a bit of a spectrum, I think, from the sort of minimalism to flexibility, maybe as the other side. Maybe the far side is like
Mm.
maximalism or something. You're like, I am on all the time. But yeah, how do you think about that in terms of couples?
It's so individual because everybody is so different. So, but what works for, like Bruce was saying, what works for one person might not work for another. So to cut up, some people might need that, to cut the cord completely and get off of digital media,
Mm,
or and some of them might, be able to pull back a little bit, and others might feel, well, this is like the greatest thing. I get to see people all over the world. I get to experience things. I get to learn about things. I get to travel to places I might never go to. So there's all different ways that you can look at it. I think the problem is how you approach it. So
mhm,
is it an evil thing in your life? Is it taking over? And if it is, then you might need to pull
mm,
back. But if it's something that can enhance something, so let's say you're watching a video that you want to share with your spouse, or like, it's like when you read something funny and you want to read it to them. We share funny videos with
Hmm.
each other all the time because it's something that I enjoy, and or something that Bruce finds particularly amusing, and that can be a plus, a positive. So
mm.
I guess it depends on your relationship and what it is and how involved you are with it. Is it
So,
taking over your life, or is it a part of your life?
aha, yeah, I like that. So let me put a scenario to you that I faced in my own marriage, that was an instance of digital overwhelm. And I haven't really thought about, I didn't put this in the book, because it just, until I was talking to you, it didn't occur to me. But when I came to Grand Rapids a few years ago to teach at this university, we didn't have a house yet. My family didn't have a house yet. And so I came first, and I was living in somebody's apartment for a few months. And so, for the first time in quite a while, my wife and I were living apart from each other. And I am a language guy, as you can probably tell talking to me. I'm a verbal processor, and I'm very like I live comfortably in words. And my wife is also a very articulate person, but she's more of an internal processor. Let me go think about that, and then I'll come and talk to you sort of person. And I found our digital exchanges pretty much endlessly frustrating because
Mm.
hers would be very, very brief,
Mhm.
often blunt, just like a very pragmatic question, and mine would be, ornate and at length. And so we were completely misfiring there. And I at one point said, I think we should stop communicating via phone. It's just, or, smartphone. It's just not
Mm.
working for me. And
Mhm.
she really pushed back on that. And so yeah, I wonder in that scenario where you have a couple that's sort of trying to communicate digitally in this way and missing each other, what kind of advice would you give?
Well, I can take that one. That actually comes up. And that's where, it's funny. My snarky title is not about communication. You're obviously describing a communication issue. Of course it is. You know what I mean? I realize it's not. That's not the issue. It's that the problem isn't that either one of you isn't skilled at communicating, even by that particular medium. The problem is what you're communicating.
Mm,
What you were, and maybe accurately, maybe not, hard to say. What you were hearing in your wife's responses was perhaps a kind of rejection. It was she was and of course what she was hearing in your suggestion that you not do it was a kind of rejection, and you both
right,
perhaps were hurt by that.
right.
And so what I do with that, if it's a couples therapy issue, what I do with that is invite people to go ahead and tolerate the anxiety. I once suggested to Judy if people did a drinking game, and when during our podcast, every time I say tolerate the anxiety, they get drunk by the end. But there it is. It's one of my favorite little, tolerate the anxiety without crossing over into freak out, if you were able to tolerate the anxiety of saying, wow, that feels rejecting, but I know you don't, we actually do love each other. We actually do care about each other.
Mm,
Um, those moments of intimacy, if you can actually get there,
mhm,
then you can figure out, well, what do we want to do about this? Which actually leads me to ask you,
Mhm.
Tell us about this mode switching thing, because I suspect that's kind of what you're referring to.
Yes, the sort of framework that I came to slowly in the course of writing this book, and then alongside the book, you know, you know this, Bruce, like writing a book is a long and sort of lonely work, and so you crave interaction and a place to maybe in a more short-term way process some of what you're encountering. So I started a newsletter on Substack. Like so many people, I just follow people around and do what they do. But the
Don't we all?
the newsletter is called The Mode Switch, and basically it's about work culture and relationships in work culture, and thinking about how can we you can't change your company. You can't renovate your institution, or very few of us can. You can't transform the ecology of your organizational community, but you do have a zone of action. You do have a space where you can make some difference. And in that, I think we should be super attentive to ways that we can make a shift in our mindset and or our behavior and become more flexible and help others around us to be flexible. So my basic advice, like I've hinted at in our conversation so far in the book, is basically have a tool belt of modes. Don't just have one that you're good at, like a hammer that you pound everything in sight with, but multiple modes of communication. And maybe you can get good at three of them. But that sort of flexibility will help you to cope with the anxiety. What was your phrase? Bear with the anxiety?
Or tolerate the anxiety.
Tolerate it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you can be like, okay, that didn't feel good, but let me try it from this mode. Yeah, you might find your way into just a freer and more liberated sort of way of relating to your coworkers. But I will say, to circle back to your work, that some of the most interesting conversations that I've had have really crossed the lines between work culture and, I don't know, domestic life. I remember one person very strikingly telling me about how lonely remote work is, even though her spouse is in the house as
Mm,
well.
yeah.
And that fascinated me because it's so counterintuitive. Like your bestie is with you in the house and you're lonely, but there's a certain sort of awkwardness that this person described that can happen when you're just kind of the only person that you meet in the hall on the way to the bathroom is your life partner.
Hmm.
It can get a little claustrophobic. And so, like, you need other colleagues and coworkers and friends and community. And so there's a weird sort of loneliness that can happen even in a good marriage, as this one was, as far as I know, yeah, I wasn't exactly expecting.
Mm.
I think I'm like your wife. I have to think about things. So I'm like back on your question, what you asked me about what would
Mhm,
I do?
mhm.
Um, did you ever ask her, uh, why is this not, it seems to me like this isn't working for you. Why isn't it working? Or if maybe being face to face wasn't her mode of communication, maybe because she does need to think about things, letter writing could have been a
Hmm.
better mode of communication.
Yeah, yeah,
So, other possibilities to think about.
yeah.
Anyway, so I
That's,
digress, but
oh, no, that's great.
but that's what I would have thought about if I had time to think a little bit
Yeah,
more. So,
I like that. I did not ask that question. I would have been better to ask that question. And interestingly, our relationship, when we met 30 years ago, like that's what we did. We wrote letters.
mhm.
Ah,
No email. Phone calls felt a little like expensive for some reason. I don't think they were, but they felt that way.
they
They
boy,
probably were.
back in the day, I mean, I remember 50 years ago, and I remember when I was working and I worked 1 day to pay the rent and 2 days to pay the phone bill.
It's,
That's what it was like. We're going back a ways now. But anyway, yeah, yeah, phone calls used to be
yeah.
expensive.
What I did do was I did tell her like this isn't working for me and I think we should pull back. I think I was being too extreme in saying we should pull back. I should have said this isn't working for me. How can we do this better? But
Mm.
what she responded to was Well, this is a hard season for us, and we're going to have to just depend on the fact that we have, we've committed to each other, and this is uncomfortable, and we'll get through it. We'll be all right. So, and that was honestly the word I needed at the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
I remember that text as being a very good text.
Yeah. Yeah, that is that's it's interesting when you were describing, you can't change the ecology of your organization.
Hmm.
And there's certain ways in which I could substitute the word marriage for organization. And I mean marriage, not just partnership. And I've addressed this in various places, that when people are married, one of the interesting things about marriage, and it often takes people by surprise, is that you don't get to define what it is. I'm always a little
Hmm.
I can be so, I'm not that snarky. Am I that snarky? Well, maybe sometimes I'm that snarky. I can get, when we go to a wedding and we see people who wrote their own vows, and it's beautiful. I don't mean to be too cynical about that.
Hmm.
But I always, this little voice in my head is saying, oh, isn't that cute? They think they can define it. And in
I love
fact,
that. Wow.
it's bigger than all of us. In the religious sense, it's like you're married before God. But
Uh-huh.
even in a non-religious sense, you're married before your community, you're married before the state. Those things are not insignificant. You can't change that ecology all by yourself. You can
Uh-huh.
think you can, but you really can't. But what you do have is a zone of action, as you're describing. And your wife's pointing out,
Hmm.
yeah, this is a hard time for it. Hard to be a married couple living in two separate places, especially if you have two different styles of communication, right? Like, okay, well, that's tricky, isn't it? But she just expressed that sense of, but we're in this, we know we're committed to the marriage. We know we love each other, in effect. I mean, that's what she was implying, if not saying it. And so we'll be okay. It'll just be uncomfortable for a while.
Yeah.
To me, that sounds like, well, yeah, that's tolerating the anxiety. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I think that's
Yeah.
right.
One of the things that we wanted to talk about with you was how you cite biblical texts
Hmm.
on dealing with relevant problems in the digital age. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we're both people that love reading the Bible
Okay.
and
Okay.
studying it. And
We're
Sure.
Jewish, and Judy is a retired educator and used to run the religious school at our synagogue,
Oh,
and we both study Torah and Hebrew, and we're into that stuff. So
oh, that's
I really,
good.
yeah, I really did enjoy in your book how you
Uh-huh.
cited that. Anyway, please, yeah, tell us about
Yeah.
that.
Yes. Okay. Well, it's great to be in the company of people of faith. Um, yes, I think the flaw in my book project, and have been sort of having coffee with people who are reading it or who have read it, and the sort of signal flaw is an attempt to like say everything, try to just say everything that needs saying about this. But the maybe the strength of that flaw, like the virtue that accompanies the vice of its ambitiousness, is that I really need myself older voices in the conversation of my heart, who can help me keep my bearings when things seem especially crazy. So for me, those older voices are varied, but the wisdom literature of the Torah. Excuse me for just a moment. Oh, pardon me. The wisdom literature of Torah, and especially some of the more cantankerous voices, like Job,
Hmm.
and the philosopher who is the main speaker in the book of Ecclesiastes, or the psalmists, the hard questions and the skepticism and um, the frankness of these voices is terribly important to me because I have to say, like, one of my own flaws is I can be kind of a sunny person, and like, let's look on the bright side of things is a kind of habit of mine. I'm really resistant to lament.
You Monty Python right now, but anyway, that's right.
Oh man, if only we could. Let's do
Yeah.
it. Oh, you mean the guy who's playing the record,
always, no, always look on the bright side of
Yeah.
life.
Yes, right. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, geez.
I'm of that side
Yeah.
too, really, so
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
can relate.
Yeah.
Okay. So
See,
these
what I add to that is arrogance. And I think, yeah, what you're
yeah,
describing is a
yeah.
check, of course, on just being on the sunny side. And it's also a check on arrogance. I think, a good sense of intellectual humility,
Hmm.
not just intellectual, but humility in general, is one of the things that traditions can offer. It's
Hmm.
like, oh, you mean I'm not the first one that's thought about this stuff, and I
Uh-huh.
don't have the last word on the subject? Yeah.
Right. Right. That's right. That's right. I mean, it is so amazing that Job, the book of Job, is so often cited in modern times by people who are not necessarily people of faith, but who are trying to make sense of our technologized condition.
Mm.
Um, there is a writer from I want to say the mid 20th century. His name was Norbert Wiener,
Oh,
Weiner.
sure.
You
Yeah.
know him. And
I mean, I know, yeah,
yeah,
cybernetics. He was all about cybernetics.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Cybernetics. And he wrote about the book of Job.
Mhm.
So strange to me. And then more recently, and the way I encountered this, I'd love to say it was just from my own sort of perusing the world, but there's a wonderful writer named Megan O'Giblin who wrote a book called God, Human, Animal, Machine. And she's really trying, again, to make sense of the weirdness of our times in a world of automation and artificial intelligence and, a kind of, I don't know, a sort of transhumanism. Um, she goes back to the book of Job and she looks at how the voice of God in the book of Job or the appeal to providence is rather like the way we talk about algorithms today. So,
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
You
trust
yeah, I think
algorithms.
you mentioned that in your book, right?
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
you say her in your book. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'm a huge and I'm an enthusiast for her work.
Mm.
But yeah, so for me, the books of the book of Job, the book of the Psalms and the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, like these are books that both allow a certain kind of skepticism and for me a needed corrective to a sort of determined cheerfulness. But they also, yeah, they just open up the horizon. Like I think you said in an exchange with me before our podcast by email or something that if we're dependent on the latest thing that we read on Instagram or Twitter, that's a really small horizon, and there's bigger stuff going on. So I think those older voices are really, really helpful for seeing a longer, wider horizon.
Hmm. Yeah, and I noted this in your book that there's a sense that when you introduce that kind of understanding, when you invoke those traditions and those old, the wisdom literature, that it's it's a nice antidote to that sense of I don't know, it softens the whole thing or something. It's
Mm,
like, oh, I don't have to think that I have to solve all this by myself
mm,
because
mm,
people have been working on this for a very long time and are still working on it.
mhm.
And it can help people relax a little bit, I think.
I'm interested in that word of soften. Like, can you say more about that?
Yeah. It's, I suppose in contrast, soft in contrast to hard. So the edges don't feel so sharp. It
Mm,
can feel like, oh, they can put this in a bit of perspective. Like people have been struggling with these kinds of things.
mm,
People haven't been struggling with email for that long, but they've been struggling with being overwhelmed for a long time. They've
mhm.
been
Yeah.
struggling with a sense of, I don't know how to change these forces that seem to
Mm,
be so oppressive.
mhm,
And but somehow adopting a mindset or exploring a mindset can make a difference.
mhm,
Just that thought, I think, invoking that sort of old literature, that just the fact that, yeah, this is not new.
mhm.
uh
There's
yeah,
nothing new under the
there
sun.
is nothing new under the sun. Exactly. Yes. Gee, you should write that down. That's a great quote. Yes.
To coin a phrase. So
Yes.
I'm very shaped by a theologian named David Ford, who's a British theologian, and I'm talking about theology more than I usually do in a podcast like this, so
Mm.
this is fun. But you can edit
So are
out.
we, by the way. Just
Yeah. So, yeah, Ford was the one who kind of introduced me to what is an obvious reality as soon as you name it, like you just did. But yeah, to be human is to be overwhelmed. Like you're just constantly surrounded by a natural world that is much larger than you can manage, and just your relational life, your organizational life, all of these things are genuinely overwhelming. Life before God is overwhelming.
Mm.
So, like, the sooner that we can be frank about that and say, with the honesty of the psalmists, like, why is this happening to me? I think the better we're gonna do. There's a kind of paradox, right? Like, the more you're
Yeah.
willing to acknowledge you're overwhelmed, the better you can navigate it. I
Yeah.
think that's true. I think that's true.
Yeah, when I use the word faith, and our you can hold up our merch. We have merch. Our podcast called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Those are the 7 words: be kind, don't panic, and have
Oh.
faith.
Hmm.
And when I use the word faith, it is very much in accord with what you were just talking about. The idea that, well, of course we're overwhelmed, but the faith part just says there's something right about it.
Hmm.
In religious terms, Western religious terms, it would be that whatever God is good
Hmm.
fundamentally. There's something good about it, even though it's hard to understand, it's painful, it has
Yeah.
tragedy in it, all of that stuff.
Hmm.
The essential mindset that says this whole business has got to be workable or at least meaningful or something. That's the mindset that will get people through things. And I think again, you're writing about digital overwhelm or digwhelm as you call it, which is a cute portmanteau word, or is that a portmanteau? Whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, and yes, I really enjoyed how you said that, by the way, because it's not always overwhelmed. Sometimes it's underwhelmed.
Hmm.
So that's why you called it digwhelm, which I just thought was brilliant. I
Okay.
really, but that phenomenon that, yeah, we could be overwhelmed, like you said, overwhelmed by God, yeah, this whole picture is way bigger than we can possibly understand, much less control.
Hmm.
And yet there's something right about it. That's what I mean by faith. That's the antidote to
Oh,
panic.
I love
You can,
that.
yeah, I think that's, the my little construction, be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Well, I note that people who do well in relationships are kind to each other in the sense of kinship, not just being nice, but they experience each other as kin. You
Hmm.
can't do that if you're in a panic. When
Hmm.
people are in a panic, they lose sight of that. They'll often start doubting that, and that kind of is a difficult thing, to say the least, in
Yeah.
a relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the antidote to panic is faith.
Uh-huh.
That's not a prescription, it's more of an observation. The
Uh-huh.
couples that do well are the ones who are approaching it with a sense, they'll come in with infidelity, they'll come in with
Uh,
all kinds of horrible things that have been happening, and they're having difficulty with each other and difficulty trusting each other. The couples that can get through that, together or separate, the ones that can come through that
mhm.
are the ones who are basically saying, this sucks, but it must be meaningful. The ones who don't do so well are the ones who come in and saying, we just want to go back to the way it was. Oh,
Ooh,
I'll never do that again. Let's keep going. It's like,
yeah.
yeah, that's not going to do it, because
Mhm.
you're probably not crazy.
Mhm.
So if you're not crazy, there was something there, even if it was wrong. So
You're
you better
probably.
look at that. And if you can get through that, you'll be better off.
Mm.
That's all about faith.
So let me ask you this question then from the perspective of like organizational life,
Mm,
shifting from, sort of the couples to the working community. I think some Gen Z folks would say that to, what is it? Be kind, don't panic, and have faith
hmm
could be a recipe for abuse. So they might say, if I just walk around my organization and you know, uh, I'm sort of deferential to my managers, and I refuse to, get angry, and I basically lean into the organization, they're gonna friggin' take advantage of me, and
Oh
they
yeah.
have. So,
hmm
like, how would you respond to that question?
Oh, sure. Well, that's true in a marriage or a couple relationship as well. That be kind does not imply be a doormat.
Hmm.
Be kind does not imply always, be kind certainly does not imply never get angry. Anger
Hmm.
has its place. I have a
Hmm.
whole section in my most recent book about betrayal and forgiveness. It's about, breaches of that,
Hmm.
where it is often too soon to forgive. That
Hmm.
anger of not forgiving you might need to get out of an abusive relationship. So I would not suggest to people that that just means, oh, take it no matter what it is.
Hmm.
It's funny, I suppose that's where Jews as a group deviate from Christians on the turn the other cheek bit. It's like, mostly turn the other cheek, be willing to turn the other cheek, have lots of forbearance, but sometimes don't turn the other damn cheek, whatever. I don't. And I'm going to speculate, like I can speak about, yeah, I can speak to Jesus, right? I'm going to speculate that Jesus would have agreed with me on that, but I could be
Well, he
wrong. Who
was
knows?
Jewish
He
after
was
all.
Jewish, I know. I'm saying he was one of us. But the point being, no, it doesn't imply just take abuse. It be kind implies also recognize your own validity as well as the validity. That it does mean when you're being abused, even the people abusing you are coming from some kind of framework that probably isn't crazy, even if it's awful.
Mm.
Doesn't mean stay with it though. And if you're stuck in an organization where you're being abused, that's a really hard place to be. That's very similar to being stuck in an abusive relationship.
Hmm.
And if you can't find a way of transforming it, you need to find a way to get out. And I would never ignore that as a necessary safety valve.
Thank you. I think that's really clarifying that, to be kind and to refuse to panic is not to necessarily be weak or to be overly deferential.
Oh,
And
and yeah, exactly. Yeah.
in fact, with the Jesus saying that's so often cited from the Sermon on the Mount, I think my understanding of that is that maybe the best depiction of that in contemporary times would be the nonviolent resistance of Black Americans during the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
I mean, that
Yeah.
was tremendous strength and a tremendous resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
And
also,
only worked though, I'm jumping in here, but
yeah,
only worked because the people that they were opposing had enough of a conscience that they were appalled by it. They were
mm,
appalled by what they were seeing. It would not, I
mm.
think, am I misquoting? I think Gandhi pointed out his methods would not have worked in Nazi Germany.
Huh,
And
that
I
is
may
so
be wrong
interesting.
about that, but I
That's
heard that
so
come.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me ask a question of you folks. As you are engaging this conversation across the lines of like marriage and relationships and organizations, on the other hand, and work culture, like I'm always sort of spending time with, where there's clearly a lot of overlap.
Oh
Like
yeah.
we're finding it very easy to talk to each other about ways that like, oh, that's true in organizational community. It's also true in a marriage, right?
Yeah.
But where do you sense divergence?
Mm.
Hmm.
That's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I can, in terms of the work I do with couples, there is, it's funny. I don't know if this is exactly what you mean by mode switching. I'm thinking more like code switching.
Yes.
Black people will talk about code switching. Actually, as Jews, we know that one. When I'm in a
Huh.
group that is all Jews, I'm not thinking the same way. I'm not
Mm,
talking the same way as I am when I know there are non-Jews present.
mm,
And I'm sure I've heard Black people say that of, when there are white people present, it's a very
yeah.
different conversation. So I think there's a lot of code switching that happens between organizational life and home life. And sometimes that manifests as people treating their spouse not nearly as well as they treat their coworkers,
Mm,
for example. And I hear a lot of complaints from spouses about that for,
yeah. Yeah.
for good reason.
Yeah.
I don't know if that addresses what you're asking about.
I think as I by the way, I have both felt that phenomenon. Like I get home and it is for some reason hard to be empathetic in the way that I was all day, maybe with my
Mm-hmm.
coworkers. Like that can be, I totally can relate to that, unfortunately. And then also, yeah, I think the need the recognition of code switching between the way we talk, like how you show respect and care for your colleagues is a different code than the one that you use to show care and respect for your spouse, right?
Yeah.
That seems very right to me. As I think about our two projects, and maybe you could sense this here and there in my book, one difference is that couples therapy, so I'm just going to put my stereotypes out on the table between us here,
Mm.
is it like runs on dialogue. It runs on conversational interaction.
Mhm.
And my understanding of working community is that it that if we try to run working community on dialogue,
Mhm.
we we get exclusive, we develop some tendencies towards control. Because one-on-one conversation, this is delusional, but it feels more manageable than a kind of multi-directional conversation like you're actually having in a workplace. So that's one area where, and I'm interested to hear your response to this, but that's one
Mhm.
area where I feel like there's a divergence. Like your work with couples, one-on-one, one-on-two, in organizations, it's got to be a multi-log. What do you think of that?
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Yeah, and that example I gave earlier, I didn't think of it until this conversation. That example I gave earlier of, well, I am kind of being the disseminator at first,
Mm,
but after that,
true.
the analogy I use is improv. After that, it's improv, and improv is totally dialogic.
Mm,
It's all about dialogue. It's not about, improv where the basic rule is yes and.
mhm,
It's only yes and if you're listening.
mhm,
You actually have to be changed by what you're hearing. That's dialogic. And
mhm,
so there may be elements for the therapist of both, controlling the organization, but also one-on-one.
mm,
But with the couple, once we get through some of that introductory stuff, it
mhm,
is very dialogic in ways that, yeah, wouldn't work in an organization.
mhm,
Yeah, it's interesting. That could be why I don't enjoy doing group therapy.
mhm,
I had some training in it during my internships,
mhm,
and it just wasn't that much fun for me.
mhm.
And I don't know why. There's some aspect of it where I think it's on the border of those two things, isn't it?
Yeah,
Group
yeah,
therapy
yeah.
is like the therapist has to be kind of in control of the organization,
Mhm,
but also it's all about encouraging the sort of one-on-one dialogue. And I don't
yeah.
know.
I,
What are your thoughts?
I love that. I think that my closest analog to this, and let me start by saying I think I'm probably not as capable of making decisions in dialogue as you have to be, right?
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
might actually be like for temperamental or personal history reasons, like disinclined to say, let's reduce this to a dialogue.
Hmm.
Um, when I teach, when I'm working in a classroom, that cannot be a dialogue. I'm working with 20 people, and I've got to do what Jonathan Haidt has called a hive switch there, not a mode switch. Like
Yes.
I have
Yes.
to move people into thinking about the hive, the group,
Yep.
and I can't do that. I've tried. I can't do that one on one. I've
What does he
got
say?
to.
We're 90% chimp and 10%
Yeah,
bee.
yeah,
Is that his thing? Yeah.
that's right. I
I
love
love that. He's one of my favorite authors, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. So, yeah, I think, vo maybe I should say vocationally, I'm disinclined to reduce things to dialogue, and that might be an area where we don't exactly take separate paths, but yeah, there's some distinction that can be made there.
By the very nature, it's a very different situation. In, couples therapy, you've just got three people in the room.
Hmm.
Organization, you can have, 10, you can have hundreds.
Hmm.
So to get people to interact in a certain way, that's a very, very different
Hmm.
situation.
I
Hmm.
was thinking of what your profession. You have been a teacher, you've
Hmm.
been the principal of a school,
Hmm.
and you do one-on-one, teach kids for bar and bat mitzvah.
Hmm.
And it's fascinating how I remember, when you were doing the principal thing and also teaching and also tutoring, you're navigating all of those different modes.
Hmm.
And they're not all the same, are they?
No, they're not.
Yeah.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
Teacher, like, you're in the classroom principal, you got, your teachers, you got your students, you got the
Mm.
parents, you got the organization in general that you're
Hmm.
dealing with. It's a very different situation. And I continue to tutor to this day with children and adults for bar and bat mitzvah. And I love that. That's a one-on-one situation, and you can just have a lot of fun with that.
I'm remembering when you would tell about how you would manage a classroom full of middle schoolers. There's a special place in heaven for people who can manage a classroom full of middle schoolers. I would not be, well, what little bit I used to do about that ages ago, I was not terribly good at it. But that's such a different set of skills than the one-on-one is. You seem to be good at both of them, but it ain't the same, is it? I just remember that notice. You really, well, actually, I've talked about this with parents, with couples I've worked with where they're having trouble with one of the kids. And it'll often be a situation where the kid's fine at school and a mess at home.
Yeah,
And it's not because they're bad parents.
yeah.
But one of the things I pointed out, oddly enough, is, it seems to me good teachers do love their children. They love the kids they're working with, but not the same way parents do. And so
Hmm.
what the kid benefits from is the teacher's not particularly freaked out by the kid not behaving well. It's
Hmm.
not so much the teacher's problem, so the kid can relax a little bit. There's
Hmm.
consequences,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
don't take it
yeah,
as personally.
yeah.
They're much more relaxed about it. Whereas at home, it's this incredibly personal thing for both parents and kids.
Yeah, so this is going to be a 3-hour podcast, right?
We probably should start wrapping up
probably
here. Yes.
Well,
Because
that
this
makes
could go on.
yeah, it makes me think of two things though. Like, first of all, I do have some tendencies towards dialogue with, and I've noticed this with kids actually. My wife and I have adult children now, but I remember getting home from a day of teaching, and we're all, the six of us are sitting around a table, and you know how it is with little humans, like they're standing on their chair, they're, throwing things and so forth. And I want to talk about what happened to me today with my wife. And so I'm like trying to have a dialogue in a situation that isn't going to welcome that at all.
Yeah.
Uh,
Not the time for a dialogue.
yeah.
Yes.
So, I started to learn. It took, it's taken decades, but I started to learn like, okay, sometimes you have to diffuse your attention, loosen things up, pull a kid in, pull somebody else in. And that was actually good training for the classroom in many ways, because you have to be kind of light on your feet. So there's
Mhm.
something kind of too intense that can happen with dialogue. The second thing I was thinking about is inadvertent dissemination. So digital overwhelm today creates the conditions where whatever we say in almost any space is potentially being distributed on the internet, and
Mm.
somebody's phone is recording us. And so that creates this kind of a buzz in the line for us at all times that, like, oh yeah, this thing I just did, it could show up on somebody's feed somewhere.
Mhm.
So that isn't such a great feeling. That's one of the uncomfortablenesses that we have to tolerate today,
Oh, yeah.
and also be wise about. So,
Well, who knows what happens to this podcast if somebody chooses to cherry pick and
mhm,
edit
that's right.
things and present any of us in some bad light.
Hmm.
It could
And
happen.
that's a risk, and it's interesting. Yeah, that's sort of in the background now. Tell folks how they can get in touch with you, how they can find your book.
Hmm. I'd be delighted to connect with your listeners, and I'm really grateful for this conversation. I think maybe the easiest way to connect with me is a website. It's just called themodeswitch.com. They can sign up for my newsletter there and sort of hook up with insights like this and stories like this on a weekly basis. And you can also find access to my book there, which is available, as everything else is, on Amazon easily.
Of
Digital
course,
Overwhelm.
digital overwhelm. So themodeswitch.com, we'll make sure to put that in the notes
Thank
for
you.
this episode. Thank you so much for
Thank
doing
you,
this.
Craig.
It's great to be with you both, Bruce and Judy.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed that interview with Craig Mattson. I know we did.
We did indeed, and you can check out Craig's work. And um, Judy, tell folks if they would like to get in touch with us, like to suggest themselves or someone else, what
Yes.
should they do?
So if you want to get in touch with us, if you would like to be a guest on our show, or if you have a topic you would like us to see addressed on our show, you can go to our website, ctin7.com. That's CT as in couples therapy, in 7, the numeral 7.com.
Yeah, and at ctn7.com, you can contact us. You can even sign up for a time to be interviewed by us, at which point we will ask you, what do you want to be interviewed about? And that'll help us understand and, whether you'd be a good fit. And I keep saying this, if you think you'd be a good fit, you probably would.
And you can also sign up for Bruce's newsletter.
You can.
And please do those things that people do on social media. Follow us, like us, subscribe.
Reviews are important.
Review, yes, our books, and tell all your friends about us.
Absolutely. And so until next time,
Remember, be kind
don't panic.
and have faith.